So the UAV Challenge was a flying robot competition we created in 2005, and we came up with the idea to see if we could push the world into kind of accelerating the development of UAVs. And it was an idea with my colleagues, Professor Rod Walker and George Curran. So George Curran was one of my colleagues at CSIRO, and Professor Rod Walker was an academic at QUT at the time, and I was at CSIRO as well. And we had just been talking about how do we kind of overcome these barriers to people using UAVs. And there was all sorts of barriers. There was lots of negativity in the press that they were used just to kill people. Drones in the militaries kind of thing, so they were considered bad from that point of view. There wasn't that much education around them. The public didn't know much about them. It was hard to get insurance for that sort of stuff because the insurance industry is usually based off what's happened before, so they can figure out what the risk is. And of course, it hadn't happened before. There were all sorts of these barriers, and we figured running a competition would kind of force the issue in some of these areas. So we kind of proposed this competition at the end of 2005 to our bosses at the time. And then we spent the next year and a half developing the competition, getting sponsorship. The Queensland government were extremely supportive. Boeing Australia were extremely supportive and helped run this event. And then we actually launched the event in 2007. And we've run a UAV Challenge event every year since then. And back then, the competition was all about search and rescue. So we invented this character called Outback Joe, who was this mythical character who would always get lost on a bushwalk. And the scenario was teams had to develop some sort of UAV to go and automatically find Outback Joe and drop a water bottle to him and then fly back. And we kind of didn't realize just how challenging that would be, and it took a very long time before anyone actually solved the problem. It was 2014 before a team actually fully completed the mission. So the first years of the UAV Challenge were kind of disappointing in a sense that teams would turn up and, the first few years their aircraft didn't even leave the airport. They would crash before they even got to the boundary, or we simply wouldn't allow them to continue because we had lots of safety checks, and we really wanted to be confident that they could fly and find Outback Joe. The UAV Challenge was hard because at the time the kind of the autopilots for these kind of small aircraft weren't that well developed. There had been, of course, autopilots used by big aviation companies, but on the small scale, they really weren't readily available. So most teams would have to develop their own systems. And then, of course, bugs enter the system, and this whole idea of robustness kind of kicks in, where if it's not good enough, it's very unforgiving when you're flying. If something goes wrong, it's not like a ground robot where if something goes wrong, kind of may just stop. Or you can press an emergency stop button and just have it stop, and you can go and fix something. If something's flying and it goes wrong, it tends to fall down, and that's the end of everything. And we had many teams that would turn up with very beautiful aircraft. We would also always make sure we had a beautiful team photo of them with their UAV just before. Some of them were very busy and would say, "Can't we do the photo later?" And we're like, "No, probably need to do it before, because you probably won't have your aircraft in a few hours' time." And that was, in the early years, that was the story. They would take off and crash and burn, and literally burn. I mean, there were a few fires and aircraft burning.